Hello everybody, my name is Ray. Welcome to the Evangelical Dark Web. Today, we're going to be talking about the potential war in Ukraine and the United States' justification or lack thereof for intervening in the war in Ukraine. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, and for this video, we are going to be using Erick Erickson, who is a Bush conservative, and I'll talk about Bush conservatives in a second. He is a Bush conservative, and we're going to be using his arguments for intervening in Ukraine to dive into this subject. And I'm going to be countering his arguments because I am opposed to intervening in Ukraine. So I don't want to give my reasons because I feel like I'm going to pause his video and give my own reasons while doing that. But let's just give some background on who Erick Erickson is. Erick Erickson is a Bush conservative. And, you know, in my head and probably on this channel, I make fun of boomercons a lot for, you know, their love of tokenism and Charlie Kirk and Candace Owens and Kim Klacik and just tokens and stuff like that. So we make fun of boomercons a lot, and rightfully so, but boomercons are some of the most well-meaning people on this planet. So I don't hate boomercons. We need the boomercons. But the Bush conservative is the worst of all. They are the worst of all creatures on the right. That is just undeniable. These are people that, you know, were conservative or were rising conservative voices because Bush, George W. Bush, or Bush 2 as I call him, was a left of center president. If you look at his tenure as the president of the United States, he was a left-wing president. He was more left-wing in his 8 years than Bill Clinton was with a hardcore Republican Congress. So, you know, he was an extremely left, you know, because he was a left-wing president, anyone to the right of him in conservative media could really rise to prominence. So we got a lot of people that rose to prominence. David French, Jonah Goldberg, Erick Erickson, except Erick Erickson has never really branded beyond his radio show in Georgia. He has failed to start up multiple publications. Probably because he relies on, you know, he relies on it for income, whereas, you know, Evangelical Dark Web is a hobby of love, so we can have more impact. I believe we have more impact just because we do it for the glory of God. And the other thing about Erick Erickson is he's always wrong. So he's a hardcore Branch Covidian, and I wrote an article earlier in the week torching him for trying to pretend like he is not, because he basically wants to say now, almost 2 years later, that we got to learn to live with COVID. And, you know, I torch him for that in the article because I was saying that 2 years ago, bro. So that's who Erick Erickson is, and we're going to dive into his arguments for intervening in Ukraine.
About what's happening in Ukraine, but we need to do it with a larger perspective than what you may be getting from a lot of other sources. Now, to begin, let's be very honest here. The odds of the United States going to war over Ukraine are pretty small. Nobody really wants to go to war over Ukraine. There is a problem, however. It's the same thing with Taiwan. We're not really going to go to war with China if they invade Taiwan, which they probably will do this year. The problem, however, is that if we don't, it will embolden Russia and China.
Okay, I gotta pause right here because that's a fallacy. That is a fallacy. This is apples and oranges. Taiwan and Ukraine are apples and oranges. And here's why. Poll numbers recognize the fact that these are apples and oranges. Ukraine, under 20% of Americans support boots on the ground in Ukraine. That's according to a Trafalgar Group poll. I will reference that in the article that's going to pair with this video. So that link will be in the description below. And it's around 58 to 60% or 57 to 50 to 60% of Americans support intervening for Taiwan. There's a clear difference. And the difference is Ukraine is not an ally. Taiwan is the former Republic of China. So we have the People's Republic of China, which is the West Taiwan, the main Chinese government now that we deal with, the CCP. That is the People's Republic of China. But the Republic of China was, the result of the Chinese Civil War, in which our ally China was driven out of governance in the Civil War because they lost the Civil War. And they had refuge in Taiwan. So that government found refuge in Taiwan after the United States. And, this is a bit of a controversial historical take, but America abandoned the Republic of China, who was our World War II ally. We were too war weary to really intervene in China during their time of need, despite the fact that China was our ally in the Pacific, along with Australia. If you want to look at the Pacific War, China was fighting Japan longer than England was fighting Germany, because those wars had pre-existed World War II. If you think about it, this is a tangent, but like a debate on when World War II actually began, I would actually mark it when the first war began between an allied or Axis power that was continuous. So, the Chinese and the Japanese fighting a war that, World War II then started on top of, according to, when the Western theater started, but the Pacific War started earlier. So that war ended with the communists taking over China, mainland China, and the Republic of China was forced into Taiwan, and they have beef now long lasting from that. That's why China wants to invade Taiwan. Apples and oranges, because that government that was ousted from mainland China was our ally, and we abandoned them. And because we abandoned them, we had to fight in Korea, because one led to another. So Ukraine is not our ally. In fact, I would actually say they're an adversary. So Ukraine is a puppet state, being in a tug of war. Ukraine is in a tug of war between Russia and the European Union. So, and I would say that because of Ukraine's rampant corruption, specifically as it relates to American politics, they are not an ally. And I would actually argue that because of their bribes to Democrat officials and their participation in corruption in the United States politics, specifically as it relates to Democrats, who are the enemies, who are our enemies here in the United States, the greatest enemies in the United States are the Democrats, who are a communist party. So Ukraine being like a nice little piggy bank for them kind of makes them an enemy. So Russia attacking it, what I view as an enemy, would be like India attacking Pakistan. I don't care. I cannot be bothered. Taiwan is a different story because I don't view Taiwan as an enemy. Taiwan was formerly an ally, but that the United States inadvertently betrayed. Complete apples and oranges, and most Americans recognize this. They don't equate Ukraine and China.
More. You only need to look at the situation with the Houthi in Yemen to understand the way this works. The Houthi rebels in Yemen, they're largely taking over Yemen. They were considered a terrorist group by the Trump administration. The Saudis and other Middle Eastern countries were fighting them. The Houthi rebels are funded by Iran. On the first day of the Biden administration, they got rid of the terror designation on the Houthis. The Houthis just launched terror attacks on the United Arab Emirates, causing real destruction in the UAE. Additionally, the UAE said the United States intercepted Houthi missiles targeting the United Arab Emirates. This is from the Associated Press. The United Arab Emirates and the U.S. military intercepted 2 ballistic missiles fired by Yemen's Houthi rebels over the skies of Abu Dhabi early Monday.
This is the face of me not caring because Arab nations reaping terrorism that they've sown for years. If you want to look at countries that supported the rise of ISIS, not only is America on that short list, but UAE, Saudi Arabia, United Arab, and Qatar, they're all on that list.
Authorities said the second attack in a week that targeted the Emirati capital. The missile fire further escalated tensions across the Persian Gulf, which previously had seen a series of assaults near but never indisputably on Emirati soil. It comes during Yemen's year-long war and the collapse of Iran's nuclear deal with world powers. American troops at Al Dhafra Air Base in the capital took shelter in bunkers during the attack and fired back with their own Patriot missiles. The attacks threatened the business-friendly, tourism-focused efforts of the Emirates. The Houthi military spokesman Yahya Saraya claimed the attack in a television statement, saying the rebels targeted several sites in the UAE with both Zulfikar ballistic missiles and drones. He warned the UAE would continue to be a target so long as attacks on the Yemeni people continue. The Biden administration escalated this situation by deterring attacks on the Houthis, trying to show good faith to the Iranians, and it has escalated the situation there. The Houthi and the Iranians sense weakness on the part of the United States and Middle Eastern allies, and they have escalated the situation. Russia, when it invades, not if it invades Ukraine, is going...
It's funny because recent news has this in dispute, and I'm not sure what to believe on this issue because Biden's clearly incompetent. He's clearly incompetent. I don't think Biden knows what's going on the ground. But the Ukrainians, Zelensky is their president. He's basically Ukraine Trump, not because of his politics, but because I believe he was a TV star. So that's who Zelensky is, and that's why him and Trump got along. But Zelensky is downplaying the situation publicly. But how accurate is he? Because if he basically treats this like most of the world treated COVID, he's going to have some instability on his own hands. So it's kind of he has every incentive to downplay the threat of Russian invasion, whereas Biden's incompetent. So who do you actually believe? That's just where I stand on that.
To sense weakness on our part for our failure to re-engage, and it will be expansion on their agenda. Let me explain this to you by talking about NATO. Let me give you the list of members of NATO. Albania, Belgium, Bulgaria, Canada, Croatia, Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Iceland, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Montenegro, Netherlands, North Macedonia, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Turkey, the United Kingdom, and the United States.
How many of those countries pay their fair share to NATO? I believe it was the United States and Greece. And I know that's surprising, but it was like United States and Greece were like the two nations that were contributing the most based on the standard. Like you gotta it's like 2% GDP or something like that. But it's because Greece's GDP kept going down and down and down that their spending, I guess, exceeded the threshold. So it was like United States and Greece were like the only two countries paying their fair share of NATO. These countries don't care about defending the United States. Why should we defend them? Particularly when they are when they have their own nation. Like these aren't even independent countries. They're all part of the European Union, which is an overlord nation. So they're not even independent countries. They're dependent countries under the influence of the European Union. The European Union is an adversary to the United States. They were designed to be an adversary to the United States, specifically on economics. They craft laws so that our companies are less competitive over there, specifically to target our companies, which, hate the player, not the game, but they're not our allies. The EU is not friendly to the United States. In fact, they export every single degeneracy except for abortion to the United States. America actually exports abortion to the world. That's our bad there. But hopefully we can export the abolition of abortion to the rest of the world. Because we will win.
Now let me break these down further for you, which will open the door into some thinking here.
It won't.
Maybe illuminate the situation for you. Some of these nations used to be members of the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was the Cold War entity designed to counter NATO. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed after World War II as the Soviets. If they attacked any of those members, there is an effort now by some to say we don't need NATO anymore because the Soviet Union is gone. They misunderstand history.
This guy misunderstands history.
But herein lies the problem. Albania, Bulgaria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Montenegro.
Why are we in a defense pact with a bunch of nations that have no strategic value? That's a pretty good question for any American to ask. Not only are we in a defense pact with nations that have no strategic value, but these nations don't even contribute their fair share.
North Macedonia, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia. They All of them were part of the Warsaw Pact. They were all controlled by the Soviet Union. Some of them were part of the Soviet Union. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they were the Baltic republics, we call them now.
Remember, Lithuania is the country that's going hardcore vaccine passports. So they're not an ally.
Were taken over first by the Soviets.
They just provide great basketball
They got freedom
players.
and immediately sought out the West.
And Croatia.
Slovenia, Slovakia.
Shout out to them as well. In the
we used
NBA.
to have a country on the map called Czechoslovakia. We now have two countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. They were forcibly united by the Soviets. And after the Soviet Union fell apart, they broke up, went their separate ways.
He's trying to sound smarter than he actually is.
Montenegro,
On
North
issue
Macedonia,
by going through a history lesson.
Slovenia, Croatia, they all were connected to Yugoslavia.
And if he names a bunch of countries,
the sphere of
his
influence
audience
of Yugoslavia
can't
and the Soviet
name.
Union. Bulgaria,
You know, I guess he's
Hungary,
trying to be the smartest man in the
Romania,
room.
Poland, all of them within the Soviet sphere of influence. And therein lies the problem for those who think NATO is a relic of the Cold War for which we no longer need. The Soviet Union, at its heart, were a bunch of Russians who still maintained, despite throwing off and killing the Russian Empire and czars, the belief of a Russian sphere of influence, a natural sphere of influence. Since Catherine the Great and Peter the Great, the Russian czars and then the Soviet Union, and now Vladimir Putin and the Russian Republic, have viewed themselves as possessing a sphere of influence that extends into the eastern portions of Europe and the northern portions of Asia, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan.
This is how you know Erick Erickson is borderline retarded, is that he believes that a sphere of influence is unique to Russia only. You don't think America views NATO as its sphere of influence, even though these countries are of no strategic value? Like, no strategic value? How about we create a bigger sphere of influence in the Pacific, which we do have, but how about we form a more strategic alliance in the Pacific to counter China? How are these nations going to help us counter our actual adversary in China? It's just nonsense. This alliance is so outdated, doesn't meet our current needs. It doesn't meet our current defense needs. These nations cannot contribute to our defense. Nor, you know, if America is attacked, you think North Macedonia is going to care? You think North Macedonians are going to die for American soil? No.
Armenia, Azerbaijan. They even view it as in Turkey, and Vladimir Putin has slowly been turning the Turks against us. The Turks were one of the original NATO allies. They're turning against us.
The Turks aren't our ally either.
And Vladimir Putin is doing his best to turn them towards Russia. Now, there are problems there because historically, the Ottomans and the Russian Empire were at war over the Crimea, Georgia, and other areas there. And so there's a lot of deep historic distrust there. But we are dealing...
This is, again, he's trying to sound smarter than he actually is. In World War I, Germany, historical adversary of the Ottoman Empire, contracted the Ottoman Empire for an alliance against Russia. So past enemy, you know, bygones can be bygones in foreign policy. England and France became allies shortly before World War I. So the idea that, okay, these countries were enemies in the past, therefore that, you know, they'll be enemies in the future. This is not South America. This is Europe. It's way more intricate. There's way more of a sense of bygones be bygones if it helps our country advance our ball now.
Not with short-term thinking here. We're dealing with long-term thinking that American impatience has a problem processing because so many Americans deal with short-term thinking. We think in terms of midterms and presidential election cycles. The Russians think in terms of history, in terms of 50 years, in terms of 100 years. We may not be dealing with the Soviet Union, but we're dealing with a KGB czar who is now the president of Russia. In Vladimir Putin, he has the Soviet thinking. And the Soviet thinking of their sphere of influence is premised on the Russian czar's ideas of their sphere of influence.
Again, sphere of influence is a thing in geopolitics. This is not unique to Russia. Like, in early 1900s, all of Europe had carved up China for its sphere of influence, and America kind of was left out of that deal. But, you know, that was like where we kind of made more alliance with China because we were cut out of that deal. But everyone believes in sphere of influence. This is just such an outdated, like, I get that he thinks that it's an outdated, archaic notion in geopolitics, but, you know, I prefer, you know, sphere of influence and imperialism to this anti-imperialistic, let's install democracy in Afghanistan and let China get the natural resources. I prefer that Putin's line of foreign policy and his foreign policy philosophy for our nation than our current one, or lack of philosophy. It just makes no sense that we go to Iraq, we don't reap any of the natural resource benefits. We go to Afghanistan, we let the Chinese get the natural resources. Like, there's no point to this. And then we install governments that are doomed to fail because democracy does not work in the Middle East. It just doesn't work. They don't have the prerequisites for that.
So the Russians want Ukraine. Ukraine was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. There was a terrible famine there as well. Stalin killed millions of Ukrainians. When the Soviet Union fell and we had Russia and Ukraine separated, it used to be the Ukraine, now Ukraine.
It's just
Crimea
Ukraine.
had historically been the realm of the Russian czars, but it was in Ukraine, and they allowed Russia to keep a navy base there. Russia organized essentially a rebellion there and took over the Crimea for themselves. There was nothing any of the Western powers could do about it.
This is a incomplete truth. Because in 2014, there was a coup in Ukraine. A democratically elected government was overthrown in Ukraine because they were having a bidding war on who could give Ukraine the biggest bailout. The EU and the Russians were having a bidding war, and it was sort of like at the 11th hour, the Russians outbid the European Union. The pro-Russian president, whose name I can't remember, went with the Russian deal. He took the Russian deal and was overthrown in a color revolution. If you are familiar with George Soros and left-wing color revolutions, a color revolution overthrew Ukraine. And then the Russians, because there was an illegitimate government in Ukraine, took over Crimea. They sent troops in unmarked, and they took over Crimea, staged an election. The people voted to leave and join Russia, because Crimea was an area with a bunch of ethnic Russians that spoke Russian. And those people do not regret 2014 and becoming Russia. They don't regret that there. That's an American myth that we are so misinformed on the situation in Ukraine. And in fact, the rebellion in Ukraine that shortly followed that is completely justified because there was an illegitimate government in Ukraine. Because they ousted a president that was duly elected in a color revolution, not in an election, in a revolution. And that's what happened. And then you had one of the most corrupt regimes in Ukrainian history, and that's saying something. That's when all the Burisma and the Hunter Biden stuff was going on, and Zelensky supposedly rose to power trying to combat that. We'll see how successful he is, but that's what happened in Ukraine. And again, I don't think Russia was unjustified in that. Annexation, expanding your territory is not unjustified, is not an unjustified war goal.
Russians have always wanted a fleet on the Black Sea to be able to get out into the Mediterranean. They needed Crimea to do it. It was of strategic importance, and so they grabbed it, and they've kept it. They have incurred into Georgia, a province there where Edward Shevardnadze was for years the president of Georgia. He had been the last foreign minister of the Soviet Union, became the president of Georgia, maintained a lot of Western ties there, was very corrupt. Ultimately, I think he passed away a few years ago, but there had been a revolt, new leadership, and then the Russians came in and took over and installed their people. The Russians believe in a sphere of influence. And now herein lies the greater problem. Albania, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia.
I'm here wondering why America doesn't believe in a sphere of influence, because we have a socialist Canada on our northern border. That's just toxic for our national politics. That's why you want a sphere of influence. It's not only good for Russia, because if you think about it, Russia is a very large nation. So they have a huge border. So that means that it's good to have a buffer state that will be more that can defend portions of border. That's one theory about why Russia needs buffer states. It's good to have a buffer state, and America has a socialist country on our border, and it's not good to have enemies on your border. It's good to have a buffer. It's good to have a sphere of influence. These things are good. These things are necessary if you want to build a nation.
Yeah, Romania, Poland, Montenegro, North Macedonia, all of these countries, the Russians view them as being in their sphere of influence. Now, none of these countries liked the Soviets. They don't like the Russians. They didn't want any part of those. Some of those countries have moved back into heavy-handed authoritarian types. But overwhelmingly, they haven't liked the Russians. They have liked Western Europe. They have wanted to lean to the West. The Baltics in particular, even though closer to the Soviet Union than, for example, Poland, have been very pro-Western. And yet the Russians believe they should be in their sphere of influence. Now, these are NATO allies. If the Russians take over Ukraine and we do nothing, they're not going to stop at Ukraine, and they're not going to stop at Ukraine because the Russians believe they have a natural sphere of influence. So already they're making rumblings. Vladimir Putin has openly said Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, they need to come home. Even the Finnish are bolstering their military resources on their border because the Russians have been making claims on Finnish territory. Which,
I mean, good luck. If you study the Winter War, where Finland just completely overperformed in the Winter War, which was during World War II. So Finland completely overperforms because, they were actually pretty good at defending their own border. They didn't, they had territorial losses, but they did a pretty good job at incurring Russian losses. So, again, Russia invading Finland, maybe their new and improved strategies will work, but again, I don't think that's that's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off. But as for the Russian view of the situation, they believe the breakup of the Soviet Union was tragic. It's not that they miss the Soviet Union. Vladimir Putin famously said that anyone who doesn't miss the Soviet, or I'm trying to get the order right, because it's anyone who wants the Soviet Union back doesn't have a brain. Anyone who doesn't miss it doesn't have a heart. He said something along those lines where there was something about it that you missed, but you did not want to bring it back. You didn't want to bring it back. And Vladimir Putin doesn't want to bring back the Soviet Union. But he does want to bring back its territorial borders. That much is clear.
They believe is in their natural sphere of influence. But do any of you want your kids to die for Montenegro?
No.
Or Albania? Do any of you want your kids to die for North Macedonia?
Nope.
Or
North Macedonia changed their name from Macedonia to North Macedonia because they got into a heated exchange with Greece. It was a very obscure foreign policy incident. Or not incident, but long-standing issue. If they can't even stand up for their own name, they're not going to stand up for us. So why should we stand up for them?
Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia? Anybody? Putin knows this. Small surrenders get you very big wars. And Putin understands this. And we have a geriatric president right now who may not comprehend that.
So this is the height of hubris. Because if you look at the prelude to World War I, which is the Great War, that's what they called it back then, because they didn't have a World War II to call it a World War I. They called it the Great War. And what was the thoughts? They had this grand geopolitical school of thought called the balance of power theory, that if all these countries formed an alliance to counteract who they viewed as the big fish in the pond would be kept in check. That was the grand school of thought during the prelude to World War I. That's why you had all these entanglements. That's why you had all these alliances. And Europe was in a relative peace. It was in a relative peace. So because of this relative peace, everyone thought that this balance of power theory was good for Europe because it kept the peace. But ultimately what happened was, when a war did break out, it created a scenario in which the war would be longer, harder to end, and bloodier. So that was the height of hubris in the build-up to World War I. And this is no different. This is still a height of hubris that we can prevent war by just trying to use foreign policy maneuvers.
No one wants war in Ukraine. There are a lot of people, I have friends of mine who say, Europe, screw them. The problem here is that Vladimir Putin is also working with Chinese President Xi, who wants to do the same thing with Taiwan, and we're not going to fight over Taiwan.
Apples and oranges.
But Xi has said that his natural sphere of influence, when you show maps from China that originate in China, and they show China, you know China includes Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, the Philippines, lots of the South China Sea. They have expansionist territory there. We don't defend Taiwan. Suddenly they start looking at North Vietnam. Suddenly they start looking at the Philippines, which, by the way, used to be American territory. Small surrenders lead to big wars.
So here's a couple more problems with what he said. Like, Putin and China, I don't think are as friendly as people make them out to be. That is to say that Putin does not want to be second fiddle to China. That's not the game he's playing. He does not want to do all this nation building only to be second fiddle to Chinese. That's why Russia isn't, as embraced they are not embracing the Chinese as much as other Western nations are. Culturally, they didn't buy into the Great Reset agenda that is mostly pro-Chinese. The European Union did. America, specifically left-wing America, and the grifters on the right did. So Putin's not interested in this long game of politics only to be second fiddle in the shadow of the Chinese. That's not the end game of Russia. And I think there are some tensions in that relationship that a good foreign policy would exploit or drive a wedge between China and Russia. That's what a competent American foreign policy would do, is drive a wedge between those two nations, which is, when Nixon went to China, that's what he was trying to do, is drive a wedge between those two nations. It's not like America's never attempted that and never attempted that successfully. But that's certainly something that America should be trying to do again. And the European Union is, again, they're an adversary to the United States. Everything that the Democrats want to do here, except for abortion, that's the one exception, they did over there first. And the Great Reset agenda, the European Union is gobbling that down. Specifically the Fourth Reich over there. So tell me how Russia attacking Ukraine, which will destabilize the European Union, tell me how that's bad for the United States. It's not. I look forward to the European Union and the EU citizens not having the luxury and affluence to entertain left-wing social ideology that, if they were impoverished, would not be able to dive into. You can't worry about you can't worry about transgendering children when you have war on your doorstep. You can't worry about just degeneracy and globalism when you have war on your doorstep. You can't worry about these things when you have rising political instability. So I don't care. And then that'll wake America up. So we're in this for the long haul. I'm not interested in dying for Ukraine, and under 20% of Americans are. So that's the good news, is that this is highly unrealistic. And Erick Erickson is using a apples and oranges comparison that Taiwan and Ukraine are the same. They are completely different scenarios. Now, the invasions could happen at the same time because both nations would want to, for their own separate reasons, take advantage of a geriatric president. That much is true. But these are two entirely different scenarios. America does not have a vested interest in the defense of Ukraine. They are not a NATO ally, and which is such an important point to Erick Erickson. They're not a NATO ally. I would say that they're an adversary, and that does not apply to Taiwan.
No one wants to die for Albania.
No one.
Let the Russians have it. But the Russians, if they get taste of it, they're going to want to keep expanding. And at some point, NATO either means something or it doesn't. Now, there are those, Tucker Carlson is why do we have NATO? We have NATO still because the Soviet Union may be dead, but the Soviet Union's thinking, a lot of it was premised on the thinking of the Russian czars and their expansionist taste.
No. It was premised on communism. Again, this is where neoconservatism sucks. It was about communist. It was about countering the communist. and halting the advance of communism. Because America, specifically, once FDR died, realized that that's the real enemy there. Is this communist stuff is really bad. And we can't let that take over Europe. Winston Churchill did not want that taking over Europe. There was a huge rift between the Soviets and the West for that reason, because they did not want that communism over here. So we formed an alliance to keep communism out. Not specifically Russia, but communism. Now, again, it was communist Russia, but the point was not about Russian czardom and the foreign policy views of the czars. It was about communist and communist expansion. Because Russia, because of its large stature, had a natural ability and capability of expanding. Just like Germany did. Just like the United Kingdom did. Just like America does. Just like China does. So he's trying to make it about the czars when the czars are not the reason for the season here.
And we have a lot of allies who have accepted our word. And if our word is not good to them and we let them fall to the Russians, then a lot of other countries around the world are going to start falling to the Russians and the Chinese, and the Western order collapses. And you would think that a lot of people who are bellyaching about this and or let the Russians have it are some of the people who lament the war on Western civilization and how the left has waged a war on Western civilization. And that war on Western civilization in the academy, in business, in entertainment has ultimately led to a lot of people with a lot of self-loathing in the West who don't realize that we are the world order that maintains peace and democracy. If you fall and these nations come under the sphere of the Russians, other nations will fold up shop and move into the Russian and Chinese sphere of influence. And suddenly the dominant world order will be the illiberal world order.
Our sphere of influence leads to Germany being one of the most unfree nations on earth. Australia being a prison colony again. You have more freedom in Russia than you do in most of Europe. Let that sink in about Western influence. So, Western civilization. What does that mean anymore if, Russia is pretty right-wing at this point. Europe is pretty left-wing at this point. Democrats have more in common with the Frenchmen than they do Russians. So this is just asinine. Our natural, culturally speaking, we have more natural commonalities with the Russian culture than we do the Western, lascivious European culture.
Where you will not have your freedom of speech and your freedom to travel the
world.
You don't
have freedom
protected like it is right now.
You don't have that now. You don't have the freedom to travel the world now. You have vaccine passports. You don't have freedom of speech anywhere. Except in the United States, but, not really online. And that's under attack as well. So you don't have freedom of speech in Europe. This is nonsense. This is an asinine point he's making. You don't have freedom of travel in Europe, especially Lithuania.
It will destabilize the world and put all of us at a disadvantage. Economically, militarily, national security-wise, we will be at a massive disadvantage. The United States seems to be going back to sleep in the world, and these other powers are realizing we're going back to sleep. And across the left and the right, people are like, well, I'm not going to go die for Montenegro. No, you're not, and that's the problem. We as a nation have given up on trying to defend the Western order. Vladimir Putin knows it, and pretty soon there will be no Western order to defend when the Russians start getting hungry to expand their tendencies back into Eastern Europe.
I hope that was a pun.
And spread their tentacles abroad, because these small surrenders will ultimately get us to a very destabilized world. That's why Ukraine matters. It's not that any of us want to go to war to defend Ukraine. It's that history itself shows us if we allow the Russians to start expanding, they're going to start expanding directly against us. Oh, hey, there's this old Russian province you might have heard of that they've eyed repeatedly in the past. It's called Alaska.
This guy's a joke. And just to go, again, back to history, why did America join World War I? There was no benefit. America had zero interest in joining World War I because we mostly joined because of a dubious Zimmerman telegram, which was a joke. I mean, just think about it. The idea that Germany would be asking a failed state of Mexico, which was a failed state at the time, to attack the United States. That's not a serious attempt. There's nothing serious about that. There's no serious possibility that Mexico would ever attack the United States because they were in a civil war at the time, or just getting out of one. They were a failed state. The idea that Germany asking a failed state to attack the United States was, that was used as pretense for the United States joining World War I. And what did America get out of that? Nothing. What happened to the rest of the world because America wanted to curb German expansion? Bad things happened. We gave Germany Western democracy or liberal democracy. We gave the rest of Europe, or most of Europe at the time, liberal democracy. How'd that work out? We got World War II out of that. Or we got Hitler out of that. I think World War II is somewhat inevitable because, the communist revolution in Russia made World War II inevitable. So World War II was inevitable. The players of World War II, not so much. Once you had the Soviet Union, you had a Second World War coming because they were bent on expanding. And that's why, Eastern Europe was choosing sides, Russia, Germany, and then Romania, Hungary, and we're like, oh, go with the Germans. But Hitler would not have happened if we had, not intervened in, the bad guys won World War I. Not the Ottomans, they were kind of bad guys, but the communist revolutionaries in Russia, they were bad guys. They won in World War I. They were a winner of that conflict. The French were the bad guys of World War I. The British. And Italy. What did Italy get out of that? They switched sides and got nothing out of the deal. So his mentality is going to get us into another World War I, where America did not benefit. What did America get out of joining World War I? Nothing. We didn't defend our land. We didn't defend our freedom. We defended French territory. We died for French land. What a waste. What a waste of human life, of American blood. I'm not the one who wants to needlessly kill other people's soldiers, other people's sons, for causes that don't advance American interest. That's the problem with Erick Erickson. He says that he's trying to convince us that the European Union is worth defending America's interest. It's not. Or American lives are worth defending the European Union. They're not. They're not worth that. Our blood is too valuable to defend lasciviousness of Western European culture. So that's all I got to say about that. My name's Ray. This is the Evangelical Dark Web. Bit of a long one. Definitely a controversial one. But we need to talk about these things. So if you like this kind of content, subscribe to the channel. If you really like this kind of content, support Evangelical Dark Web at evangelicaldarkweb.org/join. And I will catch you on the next one.